The ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate when Lila Marquez realized she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Not the part where she'd signed away 3 years of her freedom to save her family's crumbling construction business, though that stung, but the fact that the woman standing across from her in the sterile county clerk's office, veils still obscuring her face, was the exact same person who'd torn her design portfolio to shreds 2 days prior. Professor Alara Vaz, 29, tenured, untouchable. The Ice Queen of Viridian University's architecture department, whose lectures were less teachings and more interrogations, whose red pen had turned Lila's most ambitious sketches into a graveyard of unprofessional and structurally unsound annotations. Lila had spent the past year avoiding her like a plague, slipping into lecture halls 3 minutes late and slinking out before the final bell, all to escape those piercing gray eyes that seemed to see every flaw in her work, and maybe in her, too. But now they were legally married. The whole thing had been a blur of desperation and fine print. Lila's father's company had collapsed under a mountain of debt, the bank threatening to foreclose on the only home she'd ever known, her abuela's house, with its hand-carved wooden beams and rose garden that smelled like summer. Then the offer came. A wealthy family needed a spouse for their heir to fulfill a grandfather's will, a spouse with no criminal record, no scandals, and a willingness to sign a non-disclosure agreement thicker than Lila's architecture textbooks. In exchange, all debts erased, a trust fund to cover her tuition and living expenses until she graduated. It wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline. She'd never seen the bride's face. The lawyers had referred to her only as Client X, citing security concerns. Lila had imagined some spoiled socialite, someone who'd treat this marriage like a business transaction, which it was, and leave her alone. She'd never imagined the sharp angles of Alara Vaz's jaw, the way her fingers, long, elegant, cold, had brushed against hers when they exchanged rings, sending a jolt of electricity through Lila's veins that she'd chalked up to nerves. Now the veil was gone. Alara stood there in a tailored white blazer and trousers, her platinum hair styled in a precise side part, not a single strand out of place. Her gray eyes were expressionless, but Lila could see the flicker of something annoyance, disgust, beneath the surface as she looked Lila up and down, taking in her thrifted white dress and scuffed sneakers. "Miss Marquez," Alara said, her voice smooth as polished marble, the same voice that had made freshmen cry during critique sessions. "This is unexpected." "Unexpected," Lila sputtered, her hands shaking at her sides. "You're my professor. You're failing me. And now you're my wife." Alara's joy tightened. "I was not aware of the identity of my spouse until yesterday. The contract listed only a last name. I'd hoped it was a coincidence." She paused, her gaze sharp as a utility knife. Apparently, fate has a twisted sense of humor. The lawyers had warned them to keep the marriage secret. No public displays of affection, no mentions of their relationship, not even in private if there was a chance someone might overhear. For Alara, it was about protecting her tenure. Fraternization with students was grounds for dismissal. For Lila, it was about avoiding expulsion and keeping her family's debt paid off. But as they stood in the parking lot of the county clerk's office, the afternoon sun beating down on them, Lila realized the real problem wasn't the secrecy. It was the fact that she was married to a woman who clearly hated her, and who held her entire academic future in her perfectly manicured hands. "Here's how this will work," Alara said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her blazer pocket and handing it to Lila. "We'll reside in my property in the hills, separate wings. On campus, you are my student, and I am your professor. No eye contact unless necessary. No lingering after class. No mention of this arrangement. If anyone finds out, we both lose everything. Lila unfolded the paper. It was a list of rules, typed in Alara's precise font. Curfew, 10 p.m. on weekdays, midnight on weekends. No overnight guests. Common areas, kitchen use limited to 6 to 7 a.m. and 8 to 10 p.m. Maintain silence in shared spaces. Personal space. No entering each other's wings without explicit permission. Campus. Strict professional conduct. Grades will not be influenced by our situation. Termination. The marriage will be dissolved after 3 years. No strings attached. It read like a lease agreement, not a marriage contract. Lila's throat felt tight as she looked up at Alara. You really think this will work? Alara raised an eyebrow. Do you have a better idea? No, she didn't. So Lila nodded, folding the paper back up and shoving it into her purse. Fine. But if you fail me just to get back at me for this, You'll what? Alara said, a faint, cold smirk playing at her lips. Break the contract? Forfeit your family's debt relief? I don't think you're in a position to make threats, Miss Marquez. Lila bit her tongue. She was right. So she turned and walked toward her beat-up Honda Civic, the weight of the marriage certificate in her purse feeling like an anchor. Behind her, she heard Alara's sleek Audi start up, the engine purring like a predator. This was going to be hell. The mansion was a monument to Alara's perfectionism. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture in shades of black and white, not a single item out of place. Lila's wing was furnished with a bed, a desk, and a small couch, all expensive, all impersonal. It felt like a hotel room, not a home. The first week was a masterclass in avoidance. Lila woke up at 5:30 a.m. to use the kitchen before Alara, making instant coffee and toast while Alara's side of the house remained silent. She'd leave for campus in her old Honda, Alara departing an hour later in her Audi. They'd pass each other in the hallway sometimes, Lila's backpack slung over one shoulder, Alara's briefcase in hand, and not a single word would be exchanged. On campus, it was even worse. Alara's lectures were brutal, her critiques harsher than ever. When she called on Lila to explain the flaws in her suspension bridge design, her gray eyes were cold, no hint of recognition. Your approach to wind load is naive at best, Miss Marquez, Alara said, projecting Lila's sketch onto the screen for the entire class to see. You're relying on aesthetic over function, which is a cardinal sin in this field. I expect a complete revision by Friday. If it's not up to standard, I'll have no choice but to issue a failing grade. The class went silent. Lila could feel their eyes on her, sympathetic and curious. She stared back at Alara, her jaw tight, and forced out a yes, Professor Voss. After class, her best friend Mia cornered her in the hallway, her dark eyes wide. What the hell was that? She's never been this hard on you before. Lila shrugged, shoving her books into her backpack. She's just being strict. It's fine. Fine, Mia said. She practically eviscerated your design. And did you see the way she was looking at you? It's like she has a personal vendetta. If only you knew, Lila thought. But she couldn't tell Mia. She couldn't tell anyone. So she forced a smile and said, I'll fix it. Don't worry. That night, Lila stayed up until 2 a.m. revising her design, her eyes burning from exhaustion. She was just about to collapse into bed when her stomach growled. She'd skipped dinner, too focused on her sketch. Reluctantly, she grabbed her hoodie and headed to the kitchen, hoping Alara was asleep. She wasn't. Alara was sitting at the kitchen island, a mug of tea in front of her, reading a thick architectural journal. She looked up as Lila entered, her expression unchanged. It's past curfew. Curfew's for weekdays, Lila said, opening the fridge and pulling out a carton of milk. It's Friday. Ilara's gaze flicked to the clock on the wall. 1:47 a.m. Your definition of midnight is generous. Lila ignored her, pouring milk into a bowl and adding cereal. She sat at the opposite end of the island, as far from Ilara as possible, and ate in silence. The only sound was the rustle of Ilara's journal and the crunch of cereal. After a few minutes, Ilara spoke. Your revised design. You're focusing too much on the pylon's height. The torsional stress will be too great. Lila froze. She looked up at Ilara, who was still reading her journal, like she hadn't just offered a critique. What? Ilara finally glanced at her. The pylon. You're making it 40 meters tall, but with the cantilever extending 35 meters, the wind vortex will cause oscillation. You need to integrate a tuned mass damper and reduce the height by 10 meters. It'll compromise the aesthetic, but it'll be structurally sound. Lila stared at her. This was the first time Ilara had ever given her actual feedback, not just criticism. Why are you telling me this? Ilara closed her journal. Because I don't fail students who have potential. I fail those who refuse to reach it. You have potential, Miss Marquez, when you bother to apply yourself. There was something in her voice, a hint of frustration rather than disdain. Lila felt a strange flutter in her chest. Thanks, she mumbled, looking down at her cereal. Ilara didn't respond. She picked up her journal and stood up, pausing at the door. Don't make a habit of breaking curfew. And clean up your mess. She left, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway. Lila sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from her. She'd always thought Ilara hated her, but maybe it was something else, disappointment? Annoyance that Lila wasn't living up to her own talent? Either way, it was the first crack in the ice. Over the next few weeks, the lines between their roles began to blur. Ilara would accidentally leave architectural journals on the kitchen table, open to pages that directly addressed Lila's design problems. Lila would find her coffee mug filled in the morning, even though she'd sworn she'd forgotten to make it. They still didn't talk much, but the silence was different, less hostile, more charged. One night, Lila came home from her shift at the campus cafe soaking wet, caught in a sudden rainstorm. She was shivering, her clothes clinging to her skin, when she walked into the kitchen. Ilara was there, making tea, and she looked up at Lila with a frown. You're going to get sick, she said. I'll be fine, Lila said, trying to hide a shiver. Ilara sighed. Wait here. She disappeared into her wing and returned a few minutes later with a thick wool blanket and a hoodie, black, expensive, clearly Ilara's. Put these on. I'll make you hot chocolate. Lila stared at her. Why are you being nice to me? Ilara turned away, pouring water into a kettle. I'm not being nice. I just don't want to deal with a sick roommate. It's inefficient. But as Lila wrapped the blanket around herself, the scent of Ilara's cedarwood perfume clinging to the fabric, she knew that was a lie. And when Ilara handed her a mug of hot chocolate, topped with whipped cream, Lila couldn't help but smile. Thanks, she said again, softer this time. Ilara's gaze lingered on her for a moment, something unreadable in her gray eyes, before she looked away. Don't mention it. That night, Lila lay in bed, the hoodie still on, and thought about Ilara. About the way her jaw tightened when she was focused, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she read something interesting, the way she'd pretended not to care when Lila was cold. She was still the ice queen, but there was a warmth beneath the surface, one that Lila was starting to crave. But she knew better than to act on it. They were enemies, bound by a contract. Nothing more. Right? The first real fight happened 3 weeks into the marriage. Lila had submitted her revised suspension bridge design, confident that it addressed all of Ilara's criticisms. She'd stayed up for 3 nights straight, refining the damper system and adjusting the pylon height, and she was proud of the result. But when Alara handed back the graded paper in class, Lila's heart sank. AC-. Miss Marquez, Alara said, her voice cold as she handed her the paper. Your design is improved, but still lacks precision. The damper placement is off by 2 centimeters, which could be catastrophic. See me after class. Lila's hands trembled as she took the paper. 2 centimeters? She'd measured it a dozen times. This was bullshit. This was Alara punishing her for the marriage. After class, she followed Alara to her office, her anger boiling over. The door closed behind them and Lila exploded. 2 centimeters? Are you serious? You're failing me because of this marriage, aren't you? Because you hate that you're stuck with me. Alara stood behind her desk, her arms crossed over her chest. I am not failing you, Miss Marquez. I am grading your work based on academic merit. Your design is flawed. Deal with it. Flawed, Lila said, slamming the paper down on Alara's desk. You gave me the idea for the damper. You told me to reduce the pylon height. Now you're saying it's wrong. I gave you guidance, Alara said, her voice rising slightly. It's your job to execute it correctly. You're careless, Lila. Always have been. You rely on talent instead of discipline, and it's going to get you nowhere. Something in Lila snapped. Careless? I work 2 jobs to pay for this school. I stay up all night to finish your assignments. You have no idea what it's like to struggle, to have to fight for every single thing. You were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, with tenure and a mansion, and everything you could ever want. The least you could do is not punish me for something I had no choice in. Alara's face paled. For a moment, Lila thought she'd hit a nerve. But then Alara's expression hardened again. Get out of my office. No, Lila said, refusing to back down. Tell me the truth. Are you failing me because you're mad about the marriage? Alara took a step toward her, her gray eyes blazing. I am not mad about the marriage. I am mad that you're wasting your talent. That you're so busy feeling sorry for yourself that you can't be bothered to check your measurements. That you think this is some kind of game. I don't think it's a game. Lila shouted. This is my future. My family's future. And you're treating it like a joke. They were standing inches apart now, their chests heaving, the air thick with tension. Lila could smell Alara's perfume, feel the heat radiating from her body. For a second, she thought Alara was going to hit her. But instead, Alara's gaze dropped to her lips, and something shifted in her eyes, anger replaced by something else, something raw and intense. Lila's breath caught. She leaned forward slightly, her heart racing. What was happening? But then Alara stepped back, her face hardening again. Get out, she said, her voice low. Before I report you for insubordination. Lila hesitated, then turned and stormed out of the office. She ran to her car, tears burning her eyes. She was so angry, at Alara, at the situation, at herself for letting her guard down. That night, Lila didn't come home. She crashed at Mia's apartment, ignoring Alara's texts asking where she was. She didn't want to see her, didn't want to talk to her. But the next morning, when she returned to the mansion to grab a change of clothes, Alara was waiting for her in the hallway. She looked exhausted, her hair messy, her usual perfect blazer replaced by a plain white shirt. Where were you? She asked, her voice softer than Lila had ever heard it. At Mia's, Lila said, avoiding her gaze. Alara nodded. I'm sorry. Lila's head snapped up. What? I'm sorry, Alara repeated. I was too hard on you. Your design was good. The C was unwarranted. Lila stared at her. She'd never heard Alara apologize for anything. Why did you do it? Alara looked away. I don't handle uncertainty well. This marriage, you're unpredictable. It scares me. For the first time, Lila saw Alara's armor crack. She saw the vulnerability beneath the ice, the fear of losing control. And in that moment, her anger melted away. I'm scared too, Lila said quietly. But we're in this together, whether we like it or not. Alara looked back at her, her gray eyes softening. Yes, we are. They stood there for a long time, just looking at each other. Then Alara reached out, her fingers brushing against Lila's cheek. It was a gentle touch, tentative, and Lila leaned into it, closing her eyes. When she opened them, Alara was staring at her, her lips parted slightly. Lila's heart raced. She leaned forward, just a little, and Alara didn't pull away. Their lips were inches apart, the tension so thick she could taste it. But then Alara stepped back, her hand falling to her side. I should go prepare for class. She walked away, leaving Lila standing in the hallway, her heart pounding. What had almost happened? And why did she want it to happen so badly? After their fight, something changed between them. The hostility was gone, replaced by a fragile truce and a growing attraction that neither of them could deny. They started talking more, late at night in the kitchen. Alara told Lila about her childhood, about the pressure to be perfect, to live up to her family's expectations. Lila told her about her abuela, about how she'd taught her to draw, about the importance of the family business. They discovered shared interests, classic films, obscure architectural theorists, even a love for spicy food, and Lila found herself falling for Alara hard. But they still couldn't be together publicly. The secret hung over them like a cloud, and it was starting to take its toll. One night, they attended a faculty mixer at the university. Alara had insisted Lila come, saying it would look suspicious if she didn't attend campus events. Lila had agreed, but she'd felt like an outsider all night, watching Alara schmooze with other professors, pretending they didn't know each other. Then, Dr. Julian Carter, another architecture professor, and Alara's ex-girlfriend, showed up. Julian was tall, with curly brown hair and a charismatic smile. She walked right up to Alara and kissed her on the cheek, her eyes lingering on her. Alara, it's good to see you. Alara's joy tightened. Julian, you're back from sabbatical. I am, Julian said, her gaze flickering to Lila, who was standing a few feet away. And who's this? Miss Marquez, Alara said, her voice cold. A student of mine. Julian raised an eyebrow. A student? You never bring students to these events. Miss Marquez is helping with a research project, Alara lied. She's very talented. Julian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm sure. Well, I'll let you two get back to it. Alara, we should catch up soon. Over dinner, maybe? Before Alara could respond, Lila stepped forward, linking her arm through Alara's. Actually, Professor Voss has plans with me tonight. We're working on the project late. Alara's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Julianne's smile faded, and she nodded. Of course. I'll see you later, Alara. After Julianne left, Alara pulled Lila aside, her voice low. What the hell was that? What? Lila said, feigning innocence. I was just helping you get rid of your ex. Alara's gaze was sharp. You were marking your territory. Which is ridiculous, because there is no territory to mark. We're not together. Lila's heart sank. Right. We're just married. Alara sighed. Lila. I know, Lila said, cutting her off. It's a contract. No feelings. I get it. She turned to walk away. I'm going home. Lila, wait, Alara said, grabbing her arm. That's not what I meant. Lila looked back at her, her eyes filled with hurt. Then what did you mean? Because every time we get close, you push me away. I'm tired of it, Alara. I'm tired of pretending. Ilara's grip tightened. I'm scared, Lila. If we get caught, you'll be expelled. I'll lose my job. Your family will be in debt again. I can't let that happen. I don't care about that, Lila said. I care about you. And I think you care about me too. Ilara's gaze dropped to her lips, and Lila saw the battle in her eyes, fear versus desire. Finally, she leaned forward and kissed her. It was a tentative kiss, soft and sweet, but it sent a fire through Lila's body. She kissed her back, wrapping her arms around Ilara's neck, pulling her closer. For a moment, there were no secrets, no rules, no fear, just the two of them, kissing in the middle of the faculty lounge, the world falling away. When they pulled apart, Ilara's forehead was pressed against hers, her breath ragged. We can't do this, she whispered. But we just did, Lila said, smiling. Ilara sighed, but she didn't let go. We have to be careful. So careful. I know, Lila said. But it's worth it. Ilara nodded and kissed her again, harder this time, more desperate. Like she was scared it would be the last time. That night, they slept together for the first time. Not in separate wings, but in Ilara's bed, tangled in each other's arms. It was slow and gentle, filled with whispered confessions and soft touches. Ilara was tender, her hands exploring Lila's body like she was studying a masterpiece, and Lila felt loved, truly loved, for the first time in her life. But when Lila woke up the next morning, Ilara was gone. She found her in the kitchen, making coffee, her back to Lila. We need to talk, Ilara said without turning around. Lila's heart sank. About last night? Yes, Ilara said, turning to face her. It was a mistake. We can't do that again. Lila stared at her. A mistake? You kissed me. You told me you were scared, not that you didn't feel anything. I do feel something, Ilara said, her voice breaking. That's the problem. I feel too much. And it's dangerous. So what? We just pretend it never happened. Lila said, her voice rising. We go back to being enemies? To separate wings and silent dinners? Yes, Ilara said, her eyes filled with pain. For your own good. Lila shook her head. I can't do that. I won't. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. She spent the day avoiding Ilara, skipping her classes and hiding in the campus library. Mia found her there, sitting at a table with her head in her hands. What's wrong? Mia asked, sitting down next to her. Lila looked up, her eyes red. I'm in love with Ilara. And she's pushing me away. Mia's eyes widened. Wait, Ilara? Professor Voss? You're in love with her. Lila nodded, and for the first time, she told someone the truth. About the marriage, the contract, the secret kisses, the night they'd spent together. Mia listened, her mouth hanging open, and when Lila finished, she sighed. You're in deep, she said. I know, Lila said. And she's right. It's dangerous. But I can't help how I feel. Mia squeezed her hand. Then fight for her. She's scared, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you back. You just need to show her that it's worth the risk. Lila nodded. She was right. She wasn't going to give up on Ilara, not without a fight. That night, she went home and found Ilara in the library, sitting by the fireplace. She walked up to her, her heart racing, and sat down next to her. I'm not going anywhere, Lila said. I love you, Ilara. And I'm willing to risk everything for you. Are you? Ilara looked at her, her gray eyes filled with tears. I can't lose you, Lila. You won't, Lila said, taking her hand. We'll be careful. We'll find a way. But I can't pretend anymore. Not with you. Ilara's lip trembled. She leaned forward and kissed Lila, her tears mixing with theirs. I love you too, she whispered. So much it scares me. They kissed again, longer this time, and Lila knew that no matter what happened, they'd face it together. The secret was still there, the risk still real, but they had each other. And that was enough. For the next month, Lila and Alara lived in a state of blissful secrecy. They'd wake up together, make coffee, and steal kisses before leaving for campus. On weekends, they'd stay in, watching movies and cooking together, pretending that the rest of the world didn't exist. But their happiness was short-lived. It started with a text. Lila was in class when her phone buzzed, and she snuck a look at it. It was an unknown number, and the message made her blood run cold. I know about your marriage. Meet me at the campus cafe tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone, or I'll tell the dean. Lila's hands shook. Who knew? How? She showed the text to Alara after class, and Alara's face paled. It's Julianne, she said. She's been suspicious since the mixer. She must have hired a private investigator. Lila's heart sank. What do we do? Alara's jaw tightened. We meet her. But we don't let her blackmail us. The next day, Lila went to the cafe, her hands shaking. Julianne was sitting at a table in the back, a smirk on her face. Lila sat down across from her. What do you want? Lila asked. Julianne smiled. I want you to leave Alara. File for an annulment. And drop out of the university. If you do that, I'll keep your little secret. Lila's eyes narrowed. Why? Because you're still in love with her. Julianne's smile faded. Alara and I were meant to be. She's too good for you, Lila. You're just a student, a charity case. You'll ruin her career. I love her, Lila said. And she loves me. We're not just a contract anymore. Julianne laughed. You think she loves you? She's using you, Lila. For the will, for the money. As soon as the 3 years are up, she'll kick you to the curb. That's not true, Lila said, but doubt crept into her mind. What if Julianne was right? What if Alara didn't really love her? Oh, it's true, Julianne said. And if you don't believe me, ask her. Ask her why she's never introduced you to her family. Why she won't let you be seen together in public. Because she's ashamed of you, Lila. Ashamed of what you are. Lila stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I'm not going to let you manipulate me. I'm not leaving Alara. Julianne's smirk returned. Then I'll tell the dean. And you'll be expelled. Alara will lose her job. Your family will be in debt again. Is that what you want? Lila walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to do. Julianne's words had planted a seed of doubt in her mind, and she couldn't shake it. That night, she confronted Alara. Did you ever love me? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Or was this all just about the contract? Alara's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Julianne knows, Lila said. She texted me. She wants me to leave you, or she'll tell the dean. She said you're using me. That you're ashamed of me. Alara's face turned red with anger. That's a lie. Julianne is just trying to get between us. Then why haven't you introduced me to your family? Lila asked. Why won't we be seen together in public? Are you ashamed of me? Alara stepped back, her eyes filled with hurt. I'm not ashamed of you, Lila. I'm protecting you. My family is ruthless. They'd never accept you, especially not after finding out about the contract. And if we're seen together, we'll lose everything. I'm just trying to keep you safe. But what about us? Lila said. What about our happiness? Are we just supposed to hide forever? Alara sighed. I don't know. But I do know that I love you. More than anything. And I'm not going to let Julianne ruin that. Lila nodded, but the doubt was still there. She wanted to believe Alara, but Julianne's words had hit too close to home. Over the next few days, the tension between them grew. Lila was distant, and Alara was distracted, spending hours on the phone with her lawyers. They barely spoke, barely touched, and Lila started to wonder if their relationship was worth the pain. Then Julianne struck. Lila was in the architecture studio, working on her final project, when the dean walked in. He was followed by Julianne, who had a smirk on her face. "Miss Marquez," the dean said, his voice cold. "I've received a disturbing report. It claims that you are in a romantic relationship with Professor Voss. Is this true?" Lila's heart sank. She looked at Julianne, who winked at her. "No," she lied. "That's not true. Professor Voss is just my professor." Julianne stepped forward. "That's a lie, Dean. They're married. I have proof." She pulled out a copy of the marriage certificate and handed it to the dean. The dean's eyes widened as he read it. "Is this true, Alara?" he asked, turning to Alara, who had just walked into the studio. Alara's face was pale, but she stood tall. "Yes, it's true." The studio went silent. Lila could feel everyone's eyes on her, shocked, curious, judgmental. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. She stood there, her hand in Alara's, and faced the music. "The university has a strict policy against fraternization between faculty and students," the dean said. "I'm afraid I have no choice but to suspend both of you pending an investigation." Lila's world crumbled around her. She'd been expelled. Alara had lost her job. Her family's debt would come crashing down. Everything they'd fought for was gone. As they walked out of the studio, Lila turned to Alara, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is all my fault." Alara pulled her into a hug. "It's not your fault. It's mine. I should have told you about Julianne's threats earlier. I should have protected you better." Lila shook her head. "None of that matters now. We're ruined." Alara pulled back, her gray eyes filled with determination. "No, we're not. We have each other. And that's more important than any job or degree." Lila looked at her. "But what about my family? The debt?" Alara smiled. "I'll pay it. I have the money. And as for the university, screw them. I don't need tenure to be a good architect. And you don't need a degree to be talented. We'll start over. Together." Lila's heart swelled. She kissed Alara, her tears mixing with theirs. "I love you." "I love you too," Alara said. "Always." They walked away from the university, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The secret was out, the risk had been taken, and they'd lost everything, but they'd gained each other. And that was more than enough. The first week after the suspension was a haze of phone calls, lawyers, and quiet grief. Lila moved her things out of the campus dorm, though she'd barely lived there, preferring Alara's mansion to the cramped shared room and into the mansion's guest wing, but this time, there was no pretense of separation. They slept in Alara's bed every night, clinging to each other like lifelines, as if the act of touching could keep the world at bay. Alara's family descended like vultures. Her mother, a sharp-tongued socialite named Victoria Voss, called every morning, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've embarrassed the family, Alara. Marrying a student? A poor student? It's unthinkable." Alara would hold the phone away from her ear, her jaw tight, and say, "Lila is my wife. I love her. That's all that matters." Victoria would screech in response, threats of cutting off Alara's trust fund and disowning her echoing through the mansion. But Alara never wavered. "I don't need your money," she'd say. "I have my own career, even if Viridian is too small-minded to see my worth." Lila felt guilty, like she'd dragged Alara down with her. "Maybe we should get a divorce," she said one night, staring up at the ceiling while Alara traced circles on her back. "You could get your job back. Your family would forgive you." Alara's hand stopped. She rolled over to face Lila, her gray eyes filled with anger and hurt. "Is that what you want? To give up on us?" "No," Lila said, her voice breaking. but I can't stand seeing you lose everything because of me. Alara cupped her cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear. I haven't lost anything. I have you. That's more than any tenure or family approval could ever give me. And if Viridian doesn't want me, there are other universities, other firms. I'll rebuild my career. For us. Lila nodded, burying her face in Alara's chest. She loved her stubbornness, her loyalty, the way she fought for what she believed in. But the doubt Julianne had planted still lingered, a tiny voice whispering that Alara would regret this, that she'd grow tired of hiding, of struggling, of Lila. To distract herself, Lila threw herself into her final project, a community center for low-income families, designed to be affordable and sustainable. She worked in the mansion's home office, surrounded by sketches and blueprints, while Alara took Zoom calls with potential clients and wrote articles for architectural journals. They'd take breaks together, making coffee or walking through the mansion's gardens, and for a while, it felt like normal, like they were just a couple, building a life together, not two people running from their past. Then, Alara got a job offer. It was from a prestigious firm in New York City, one she'd dreamed of working at before she'd accepted the tenure track at Viridian. The offer was generous, a 6-figure salary, a corner office, the chance to work on iconic projects. But it meant moving across the country, leaving everything behind: Lila's family, Mia, the only home she'd ever known. Alara hesitated to tell her, as if she was scared Lila would say no. She brought it up over dinner one night, her voice tentative. They want me to start in 3 months. It's a great opportunity, but I won't take it if you don't want to go. Lila stared at her plate, her heart racing. New York City. It was a world away from Viridian, from the small town where she'd grown up. But it was also a fresh start, a chance to be together without the shadow of the university, without Julianne's threats, without Alara's family breathing down their necks. Would we be able to be public? Lila asked, her voice quiet. No more secrets? Alara's eyes lit up. Yes. No one there knows us. We can be just Alara and Lila. Married. Happy. Lila smiled. Then let's go. Alara reached across the table, taking her hand. Are you sure? You'd be leaving your family, your friends. My family's debt is paid off, Lila said. And Mia's already planning to visit. This is our chance, Alara. To stop hiding. To be together, for real. Alara leaned across the table, kissing her softly. I love you. I love you too, Lila said. They started packing, making plans, dreaming of their new life. But just as things started to look up, Julianne struck again. Lila was at the grocery store when she got a call from an unknown number. She answered, and Julianne's voice filled her ears, cold and triumphant. I hope you're enjoying your little fantasy, Lila. Because it's about to end. What do you want now? Lila said, her hands shaking. I've sent an anonymous tip to every architectural firm in New York, Julianne said. Told them about your little marriage, about how Alara fraternized with a student. No one will hire her. No one will want her. She'll be blacklisted, and it'll be all your fault. Lila's blood ran cold. You're a monster. I'm in love with her, Julianne said. And I'll do whatever it takes to get her back. Even if it means destroying both of you. She hung up, and Lila collapsed against a shelf, tears streaming down her face. She called Alara, her voice barely audible. Julianne's ruined everything. She's blacklisted you in New York. Alara was silent for a moment, then said, It's okay. We'll find another way. But Lila could hear the defeat in her voice. She knew how much that job had meant to Alara, how much it had represented their fresh start. And now it was gone. That night, Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Julianne's words, about how she'd ruined Alara's career, about how Alara might have been better off without her. Maybe Julianne was right. Maybe Lila was just a burden. She quietly got out of bed, grabbed her backpack, and slipped out of the mansion. She didn't leave a note. She just drove away, heading back to her abuela's house, to the only place that had ever felt like home. Alara woke up at 3 a.m., reaching for Lila, only to find the bed empty. Her heart sank. She searched the mansion, calling Lila's name, but there was no answer. Her phone went straight to voicemail. She panicked. Had Julianne hurt her? Had she left because of the New York job falling through? Alara drove to Lila's abuela's house, her hands shaking on the wheel. When she pulled up, Lila's Honda was parked in the driveway. She knocked on the door, and Lila's abuela, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind brown eyes, answered. Alara, she said, smiling softly. Lila's inside. She's been crying. Alara stepped inside, and there was Lila, sitting on the porch swing, staring at the rose garden. She turned when she heard Alara's footsteps, her eyes red and puffy. Go away, she said. Alara sat down next to her. Why did you leave? Because I'm ruining your life, Lila said, her voice breaking. You lost your job at Viridian. You lost the New York offer. Your family hates you. All because of me. Alara took her hand. None of that is your fault. Julianne did this. Not you. But if we'd never gotten married, if I'd never existed, you'd still have your tenure, your dream job. I wouldn't have you, Alara said, cutting her off. And what's a job, what's tenure, compared to loving you? I'd give up everything 100 times over to be with you. Don't you understand that? Lila looked at her, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared, Alara. Scared that we'll never be happy, that Julianne will never stop, that we'll always be running. Alara pulled her into a hug. I'm scared too. But we're in this together. Remember? We don't have to run. We can fight back. Lila pulled back, her eyes wide. Fight back? How? Alara smiled. Julianne thinks she can destroy us with secrets. But what if we stop hiding? What if we tell the truth about the contract, about why we got married, about how much we love each other? The public loves a love story. And once everyone knows what Julianne did blackmailing us, lying, ruining careers, she'll be the one who's ruined. Lila hesitated. But what about your family? What about the university? Let them judge, Alara said. I don't care anymore. All I care about is you. Lila nodded, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. Okay, let's fight back. They spent the next week planning. Alara hired a PR firm to help them tell their story, while Lila gathered evidence, text messages from Julianne, emails from the New York firms explaining why they'd withdrawn the offer, even the contract they'd signed 3 years earlier. Mia helped too, reaching out to journalists and bloggers who covered LGBTQ+ stories and academic scandals. Then, they held a press conference. It was in a small conference room at a hotel in downtown Viridian. Reporters filled the seats, their cameras rolling. Julianne was there too, sitting in the back, a smirk on her face, until Alara started talking. She told the truth, about the will, the contract, the desperation that had led them to marry. About how they'd started as enemies, how they'd grown to love each other, how Julianne had blackmailed them, how she'd ruined Alara's job offer in New York. Lila spoke next, her voice steady and strong. She talked about her family's debt, about her love for Alara, about how Julianne's actions had hurt not just them, but countless other students who'd been subjected to her cruelty. When they finished, the room erupted in questions. Reporters turned to Julianne, who looked pale and shaken. She tried to deny it, but Alara's lawyer stood up, holding up the evidence, text messages, emails, witness statements from students who'd been harassed by Julianne. By the end of the day, Julianne was fired from Viridian. The New York firm rescinded their withdrawal of the job offer, apologizing for not doing their due diligence. Ilara's family still didn't approve, but they stopped calling, stopped threatening, too embarrassed to be associated with the scandal. And Viridian University? They offered Ilara her job back. Ilara hesitated to accept the offer. She'd been hurt by the university, by their quick judgment, by their willingness to suspend her without a proper investigation. But Lila encouraged her. "You love teaching," she said. "You love helping students. Don't let Viridian's mistakes stop you from doing what you're passionate about." Ilara nodded. "But what about us? If I go back, we'll have to be careful again. No more public displays of affection, no more talking about our marriage." Lila smiled. "We've already fought for our love. We've already told the world. A little secrecy on campus won't hurt. As long as we're together, that's all that matters." So Ilara accepted the offer. She returned to Viridian, but things were different this time. The students respected her more, not just for her talent, but for her courage. The faculty, too, most of them had seen the press conference, had heard Julianne's lies exposed, and they welcomed Ilara back with open arms. Lila re-enrolled in classes, but she didn't have to hide anymore. She and Ilara still kept their marriage quiet on campus, no holding hands in the hallways, no kissing in public, but they didn't have to pretend they didn't know each other. They'd sit together at faculty mixers, Ilara introducing Lila as "my wife" to anyone who asked, and no one batted an eye. Their relationship grew stronger, too. They'd learned to communicate, to trust each other, to fight for each other. They'd been through hell and back, and they'd come out the other side, more in love than ever. One night, Ilara took Lila to the top of the suspension bridge they'd designed together, Lila's final project, which had been built in a park on the outskirts of town. It was lit up with string lights, the city skyline glowing in the distance. "Remember this?" Ilara said, taking Lila's hand. "Your suspension bridge. The one I criticized so harshly." Lila laughed. "How could I forget? You tore it apart in front of the entire class." Ilara smiled. "I was wrong. It's perfect. Just like you." Lila blushed. "What are we doing here?" Ilara got down on one knee, pulling a small box out of her pocket. It was a ring, simple silver, with a tiny diamond in the center. "The first ring was for the contract," she said, her voice trembling. "This one is for us. For forever. Lila Marquez, will you marry me for real this time?" Lila's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, throwing her arms around Ilara. "Yes, yes, I will." Ilara slipped the ring on her finger, then stood up, kissing her deeply. The wind blew through their hair, the lights twinkled around them, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was theirs. They got married again 6 months later, in a small ceremony in the rose garden at Lila's abuela's house. Mia was Lila's maid of honor, and Ilara's best friend, an architect from New York, was her best woman. Lila's abuela walked her down the aisle, tears of joy in her eyes. It was nothing like the first wedding. No lawyers, no contracts, no secrets. Just two people in love, surrounded by the people who mattered most. After the ceremony, Ilara pulled Lila aside, her gray eyes filled with love. "I never thought I'd be happy," she said. "I never thought I'd find someone who loved me for who I am, flaws and all." Lila smiled, touching her cheek. "I love you, Ilara. All of you. The Ice Queen professor, the vulnerable woman who's scared of losing control, the stubborn person who fights for what she believes in." Ilara kissed her, soft and sweet. "I love you too, Lila. More than words can say." A year later, Lila graduated from Viridian with honors. Her final project, the community center, was built in downtown Viridian, a symbol of hope and resilience. Alara stood in the crowd, cheering louder than anyone else, her eyes filled with pride. After graduation, Lila joined Alara's firm, now based in both New York and Viridian, and they worked together on projects around the world. They designed schools in Africa, hospitals in Asia, community centers in Europe, each one a testament to their love, their talent, and their shared passion for making the world a better place. Alara's family eventually came around. Her younger sister, Clara, reached out first, apologizing for their mother's behavior. She visited them in Viridian, and when she saw how happy Alara was with Lila, she knew she'd been wrong. Victoria Voss still didn't approve, but she sent a card on their anniversary, a small olive branch. Julienne faded into obscurity. She tried to get a job at another university, but no one would hire her, not after the scandal. She moved to Europe, and they never heard from her again. Mia got married too, to a woman she'd met at Lila's graduation. Lila was her maid of honor, and Alara was the one who designed their wedding venue, a beautiful glass pavilion overlooking the ocean. They bought a house in Viridian, a small cottage with a rose garden, just like Lila's abuela's. They adopted 2 rescue dogs, a golden retriever named Max and a black cat named Luna, and spent their weekends hiking, cooking, and working on their garden. Every anniversary, they went back to the suspension bridge, to the place where Alara had proposed. They'd bring a picnic, sit on the bench, and talk about their journey from enemies to lovers, from secret spouses to happily married wives. One night, as they sat on the bridge, watching the sunset, Lila leaned her head on Alara's shoulder. "Do you ever miss the mansion?" she asked. Alara smiled. "No, this is home. With you." Lila nodded. "Yeah, it is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn pink and orange. Then Alara said, "Remember when we first got married? You thought I hated you." Lila laughed. "I did. You were so cold, so distant." Alara kissed the top of her head. "I was scared. Scared of feeling something for you, scared of losing control, scared of what would happen if we got caught. But now, I'm not scared anymore, because I have you." Lila turned to face her, her eyes filled with love. "I have you too." They kissed slow and deep as the sun set behind the city. The wind blew through their hair, the dogs barked in the distance, and for a moment, everything was perfect. 10 years later, Lila and Alara were still together, still in love, still working side by side. They'd built a life filled with joy, passion, and purpose, a life they'd fought for, a life they'd earned. They were sitting on the porch of their cottage, watching the sunset, when Lila said, "Remember that day at the county clerk's office? I thought it was the worst day of my life." Alara smiled, taking her hand. "Me too. But it was the best mistake I ever made." Lila laughed. "Mistake? You mean the best decision you ever made?" Alara kissed her knuckles. "Yes, the best decision." They'd been through so much secrets, lies, blackmail, heartbreak, but they'd come out the other side stronger, more in love than ever. They'd learned that love wasn't about perfection, it was about acceptance. It wasn't about never fighting, it was about fighting for each other. It wasn't about being together all the time, it was about being there for each other when it mattered most. As the sun set, Alara pulled Lila into her arms. "I love you," she said, her voice soft. "Forever and always." Lila closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of Alara's cedarwood perfume. "I love you too," she said. "Forever and always." And as the stars came out, as the dogs curled up at their feet, as the rose garden smelled like summer, they knew that this was it. This was forever. The Ice Queen had melted, not for anyone else, but for her secret student wife. And together, They'd built a love that would last a lifetime. The sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their home office, catching the dust motes dancing above the drafting table where Alara Voss leaned over a set of blueprints. Her tongue peeked out from between her lips, a rare, unguarded habit Lila Marquez had learned to cherish, and her fingers traced the outline of a curved wall with a mechanical pencil, the tip scratching softly against the paper. "Too sharp," Lila said, setting down her coffee mug and sliding onto the stool next to her. She tapped the corner of the blueprint where Alara's proposed entryway jutted at a rigid angle. "The youth center needs to feel welcoming, not intimidating. Remember? The kids we're designing for, they've already felt excluded enough." Alara didn't look up, but her jaw tightened slightly, the telltale sign she was resisting the urge to argue. "Structural integrity matters, Lila. A curved wall requires more reinforcement, more materials. We're working with a tight budget." Lila smiled, reaching over to brush a strand of platinum hair behind Alara's ear. 10 years of marriage, and they still bickered over blueprints like they were back in that first semester of their contract, only now, the arguments ended with kisses, not slammed doors. "I know the budget. But welcoming isn't a luxury. It's the point. Remember when we visited the shelter last month? The kid with the rainbow sneakers, he said he'd never felt safe in a building before. We can't just build 4 walls and a roof. We have to build something that feels like home." Alara finally lifted her head, her gray eyes softening as they met Lila's. She set down her pencil, her hand covering Lila's where it rested on the blueprint. "You're right. As usual." She leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to Lila's lips, still chapped from the autumn wind, still her favorite thing in the world. "But if we curve the entryway, we'll have to cut back on the green roof." "You'll kill me if we cut the green roof." Lila laughed, nudging her shoulder. "Not kill. Just pout. For weeks. And you hate when I pout." Alara's lips twitched into a smile, a small, rare thing that still made Lila's heart race. "I do." "Fine. We'll adjust the structural calculations. But you're helping me with the load-bearing calculations. No more hiding behind creative vision when the math gets hard." "Deal," Lila said, holding out her hand. Alara shook it, their fingers lacing together for a moment before they returned to work, Alara sketching the revised entryway, Lila flipping through notes from their meetings with the LGBTQ+ youth advocacy group. The sound of Max's tail thumping against the floor and Luna's soft purr filling the silence. It was their first major project together since Lila had been made partner at Voss Marquez Architects, and it mattered. The Viridian LGBTQ+ Youth Center was more than a building, it was a statement. A place where kids could be themselves without fear, where they could find community, where they could dream. Alara had thrown herself into the technical details, obsessing over every beam and joint, while Lila focused on the human element, interviewing youth, designing spaces for art and therapy and quiet reflection. But as the deadline loomed, tensions began to creep in. Alara was working late nights, her desk piled high with structural reports, while Lila spent hours meeting with donors and community members. They'd pass each other in the hallway, tired and distracted, their usual morning coffee dates and evening walks falling by the wayside. One night, Lila came home to find Alara asleep at the drafting table, her head resting on a stack of blueprints, a half-empty mug of cold tea beside her. Her shoulders were hunched, dark circles under her eyes, and Lila's heart ached. She pulled a blanket from the couch and draped it over Alara's shoulders, brushing her hair away from her face. Alara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Lila." Her voice was groggy, thick with sleep. "What time is it?" "Almost midnight," Lila said, sitting down next to her. "You've been here since 7 a.m. You need to sleep." Alara rubbed her eyes. sitting up straight. I can't. The truss calculations are off. If we don't get them right, the green roof will collapse. And you, she paused, her voice softening. You've been so busy with the donors. I didn't want to add to your stress. Lila's throat felt tight. You're never a stress, Alara. We're partners. In everything. Remember? She took Alara's hand, squeezing it gently. We're supposed to carry this together. Not alone. Alara nodded, her gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. I know. I want this to be perfect. For them. For us. I do too, Lila said. But perfect doesn't mean killing ourselves. Let's take a break. I'll make you something to eat, and we'll look at the calculations together. Fresh eyes. Remember how we fixed the suspension bridge design? Alara smiled, a tired but genuine one. You cried because I called your pylon naive. I did not cry, Lila said, mock indignant. I got dust in my eye. From the drafting eraser. Alara laughed, a low, warm sound that Lila had missed hearing these past few weeks. Whatever you say, Marquez. They moved to the kitchen, Lila heating up leftover chili while Alara leaned against the counter, sipping hot tea. They talked about nothing important, Max's latest obsession with chasing squirrels, Mia's upcoming visit, the way the rose garden was starting to die back for the winter, and for a moment, the stress of the project melted away. It was just them, two people who'd built a life out of late nights and shared dreams, out of arguments and apologies, out of love that had survived secrets and scandals and everything the world had thrown at them. After dinner, they returned to the office, Alara spreading the truss calculations across the table. Lila leaned over her shoulder, pointing to a line of numbers. Wait. You used the wrong coefficient for wind load. The site is on a hill, remember? The wind speeds are higher there. Alara's eyes widened. I forgot. I was using the city average. She grabbed her pencil, erasing furiously. That's why the numbers were off. Thank you. Told you fresh eyes help, Lila said, pressing a kiss to her neck. They worked together for another hour, Alara crunching the numbers while Lila double-checked the measurements, their shoulders brushing, their voices low and steady. When they finally finished, Alara set down her pencil, stretching her arms above her head. It's perfect. The roof will hold. And the entryway is curved. Lila grinned. I told you it would work. Alara pulled her into her lap, wrapping her arms around her waist. I love you, she said, her lips against Lila's ear. More than blueprints. More than buildings. More than anything. Lila turned in her arms, kissing her deeply. I love you too. Even when you're a stubborn perfectionist who works herself to exhaustion. Alara smiled against her lips. Even when you're a romantic idealist who thinks every building should feel like a hug. They stayed like that for a long time, sitting on the floor of their office, surrounded by blueprints and coffee mugs and the quiet warmth of each other's presence. The project wasn't done yet. There were presentations to give, materials to order, construction to oversee, but for now, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. 6 months later, they stood in front of the finished youth center, watching as kids poured through the curved entryway, laughing and chasing each other. The green roof was lush with native plants, solar panels glinting in the sun, and the walls were painted in soft pastels, covered in murals designed by the youth themselves. Mia stood beside them, holding her wife's hand, grinning. You two did good. Like, really good. Lila squeezed Alara's hand, her eyes filling with tears. Look at them, she said. They're home. Alara nodded, her voice thick with emotion. We did this. Together. A kid with rainbow sneakers, the same one from the shelter, ran up to them, holding a drawing. Did you build this? He asked, looking up at Alara with wide eyes. Alara knelt down, her voice gentle. We did. But it's yours. All of yours. The kid smiled, handing her the drawing, a picture of the youth center, with two stick figures standing in front of it, holding hands. For you, he said. Thank you. Alara took the drawing, her eyes shining. She stood up, slipping her arm around Lila's waist. Thank you, she whispered to her, for making me see that buildings aren't just about structure. They're about people, about love. Lila leaned her head on Alara's shoulder, watching as the kids played, as the community gathered, as the sun set behind the building they'd built together. It wasn't perfect, not by Alara's exacting standards, but it was theirs. A blueprint of their love, written in steel and stone and hope. As they walked back to their car, hand in hand, Lila said, "What's next?" Alara smiled, squeezing her hand. "Whatever we want. Together." And as the stars came out, as the youth center's lights glowed warmly in the distance, they knew that whatever came next, more blueprints, more arguments, more late nights, it would be perfect. Because they had each other. Always.